Number 10, The God of the Bible. Chapter 3, continued. What does God really want? Jon Paulien, May 2020.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to continue our study of the God of the Bible. Dr. Jon Paulien is our moderator. Larry will offer a prayer.
Dear Lord, thank you so much for being with us and giving us a chance to freely discuss what you want from us and for allowing us to speak to what we would like from you. Be with us in this discussion and be with Dr. Paulien as he guides our discussion. May your wisdom be present with us this morning. In Christ's name we thank you. Amen.
At this point, it seems clear that the decisive thing that God is looking for, we mentioned Hesed in the Old Testament, faith in the New Testament. I think by now it should be fairly clear that this is not a fantasy, but in fact, this is what God is looking for. But inevitably, it raises some questions at this point. And if you go to number 7 in your handout, you'll see some of those questions raised. And we ought to take a look at this because people will object at this point. Yeah, I know that faith is important, but the only thing, the Bible has all these other things as well. And so let's read number 7 there. The crucial question at this point is trust, faith, confidence, Hesed, really enough? Doesn't it seem too little to ask? Isn't it also necessary to know God, to love God, to be justified, maybe even to be perfect? So just pondering on those questions, and I'm sure you have run into them frequently yourself when you try to express the centrality of trust in God's plan. Because people attend seminars, and there are plenty of seminars on the Bible that talk about justification by faith, that talk about being born again, that talk about learning to live, learning to love, things like that. And all of these can be helpful in their own way. But I think what we're seeking to do is get down to the common denominator. Is there a common denominator in all of these? As you're probably familiar, there's a multitude of different answers to the question, why did Jesus have to die? And we'll look at that later on in this series of seminars. But what's the common denominator? And I think the common denominator of all the theories of atonement is ultimately what we could not do, God did. And so that's the one thing that they all have in common. So they're all different ways that the Bible attempts to use human language to explain what is happening in the universe. But we've noticed in the first seminar of this series that those traditional atonement expressions aren't good enough by themselves because they all focus on us. They all focus on our needs. And it is very clear that the cross is bigger than that. Colossians 1, Ephesians 1, John 12, other texts that we looked at. The cross is bigger than just us. There's something larger going on. And when we ask the question, what does God really want? It has to be something everyone can do, and it has to be something universal in scope. So let's take a look at this, and you'll notice a series of texts, John 17, Exodus 33, Psalm 51, James 2, John 3. Each of these takes a different way of expressing what God really wants, maybe differing, it seems, on the surface from what we're saying here. So we'll want to take a look at those texts and ask the question, can the trust, faith element truly explain all of these? Larry?
You said what we could not do, God did. And that is such a powerful and yet so a simplistic statement. I thought that was very, very crucial. So thank you for saying it that way.
Okay. And this is maybe even more controversial, but you could say faith the other way. What God could not do, we need to do. And ultimately, the one thing that God cannot do because he chooses not to is make the choice for us. And so the response corollary, which is where the faith comes in, the trust comes in, etc., is ultimately there is something for us. God will not force us to be saved. God will not require us to be in his kingdom, but he allows us the freedom. It's a choice that he has made to allow us the freedom to make that decision. And so there's a sense in which there's something that God cannot do that we need to do. And those two together, I think, are at least a simplification of very complex process in the Bible at times. All right, so let's go to John 17 and verse 3. Is trust really enough, or are there other things?
And this is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent.
All right, so here's a different expression in the Bible. It says the key to eternal life. It doesn't say trust here. It doesn't say faith here. The key to eternal life is knowing God. So how do we match that? And I would suggest simply that to know God is to trust him. In other words, they are both part of a single action or a single process. To truly know God is to truly trust him. And I think when you get to know some atheists are often people who have rejected a false picture of God. So when you grow up in a church and you're given a picture of God that truly is profoundly disturbing, Larry, you get that picture and there's no easing up on it. It's just kind of relentless, torture you in the flames for eternity for a few mistakes you made in this life. When you soak in that kind of picture, many people just end up saying, no, I don't accept that. If that's what God is like, I don't want to have anything to do with him. And so I've sometimes said that atheists are a step closer to a beautiful picture of God than some Christians are. And by saying that, I also want to encourage that if you do run into atheists in your experience, rather than defending God, our natural tendency, we got to defend God. God's honor is at stake here. Well, our defense of God is often the very thing that caused them to be atheists in the first place. So when we begin to see that atheist through God's eyes, we then begin to say, all right, what is the picture of God that this person is rejecting? And can I agree with that picture? And I had an atheist engaging me just recently on the website, and he just laid out his picture of God. And I was able to just write back and say, I agree with you 100%. That is a horrible picture of God. And if God is like that, I don't want to have anything to do with him either. So we're on the same page on that point. And that's a point where you can then perhaps begin to, in relationship, open a person up to other possibilities. Daniel.
And we need to acknowledge that there are pictures of God that need to be rejected, and that is a honest and proper thing to do. Mm-hmm. So if we grew up with that picture of God, that it was the noble thing to reject it.
Well, a good friend of mine wrote a book about God in which there was a chapter he called The Blessing of Atheism. And he said that atheism is God's blessing to the church to heal it from distorted thinking and things like that. And looking at it that way, to me, was very helpful. It was healthier than the way I had approached atheists before. Gary.
It talks about knowing God, knowing Christ, knowing God. But that's a special kind of knowing. We've talked about the biblical concept of knowing, and it's been alluded to. It's certainly different than aware of. Satan's aware of God. He knows God, but he doesn't know God in that sense that John's talking about knowing God. So there's a characteristic of that knowledge that's unique, and I think that's where the blending of the idea of knowing and having faith come together.
And interestingly enough, Graham Maxwell liked to highlight the idea that in Hebrew, knowing is more than just an intellectual thing. Knowing is a very intimate thing. It's often used of sexual relations. And that brings my mind back to Hosea, where God uses that as an illustration of the kind of whole person response that he desires. Knowing is more than just an intellectual thing. We happen to know somebody or know about somebody. But the knowing that God is talking about here is becoming so intimately involved that a person understands another's deeper purposes and trust grows. All right, Henry.
Well, you mentioned something about that knowing in Hebrew, meaning the sexual relationships, but I think it's more than that. I think it's the act of intimacy. I am assuming that you can have a sexual relationship without intimacy. And I think that the figure can be distorted if we only talk about sexual relationship. I think it's more than that. That is talking about the point that you achieve of intimacy that can be related in that aspect. So I want to push it a little bit farther than that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's the point of Hosea, is that a prostitute can do all the activities that are associated with deep, intimate love, but without completely shutting off that intimacy. And that's why a prostitute was a good illustration of how God looked upon Israel, that Israel was going through all the motions of honoring him and worshiping him and so forth. But none of the things they were doing reflected a heart that was truly for God. So you're absolutely right. The point of the Hebrew is not sexual relations in the physical sense alone, but in the fullness of intimacy that is possible within a marriage, for example. Yes. Okay, Exodus 33 and verses 9 to 11.
When Moses entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent, and the Lord would speak with Moses. When all the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance of the tent, all the people would rise and bow down, all of them, at the entrance of their tents. Thus the Lord used to speak with Moses face to face, as one speaks to a friend. Then he would return to the camp, but his young assistant, Joshua, son of Nun, would not leave the tent.
Okay, and also read verse 17 of chapter 33.
The Lord said to Moses, I will do the very thing that you have asked, for you have found favor in my sight, and I know you by name.
Okay, within the Hebrew context, knowing we've already talked about, but the name signifies the character of a person. And God says, I know you by name. It doesn't simply mean, oh yeah, after we've been talking here for 40 days, I finally figured out what your name was. That's not what God is saying here. He's saying, I know you deeply and intimately. And over time, God and Moses have developed this friendship kind of relationship. And so here we see trust is integral to that. So being a friend of God is one of the ways the Bible describes what God is wanting, what God is looking for. And many of you are familiar with the stages of relationship that I've shared in various seminars through the years. But the interesting thing is, in the 7 stages of relationship, each stage is more vulnerable than the other. Each stage requires more trust than the other. If you're just at the greeting stage, you trust that nobody on the street is going to refuse your greeting or be mad at you because you greeted them. You trust enough in the stranger you're willing to greet. But then the next level is sharing facts and reports. That's more vulnerable because you can share a fact or a report and someone else disagrees with that. They can kind of, come back on you. And we see that with the COVID-19 thing, how quickly it became political in the sense that even the facts were disputed, depending on which facts would support which side of the thing. So to express what you think is a fact is more vulnerable than simply greeting someone. Then the third stage, opinions and judgments. That is more vulnerable yet. So as you go through the stages toward intimacy, each stage is more vulnerable. Each stage, therefore, requires more trust. You're willing to go to another stage with a person. Perhaps you're at the feeling stage where you're willing to share your deepest feelings because you know that that person won't crush you in the process. But then can you get to the stage where you're willing to confess your faults? That's more difficult yet. And so at each stage, people are weighing, how much do I trust this person? How vulnerable can I be safely in this relationship? And so the concept of trust is critical to relationship with God as well. So I think where we're going here is to see that all the different ways that the Bible uses to express salvation are dependent at some point on trust, and particularly trust in God. It's the friendship that is grounded on trust. Let's go to Psalm 51, verses 10 and 11 first.
Create in me a clean heart, O God, and put a new and right spirit within me. Do not cast me away from your presence, and do not take your Holy Spirit from me.
So here we see David asking for a right spirit. This is so critical for relationships, a right spirit. And again, trust is critical behind it. Perhaps all of you who have been in marriages or other long-term relationships just know that there are times when, if you're not monitoring the relationship, you can just begin to snap at each other sometimes. And you don't even realize you're doing it. But it's because in that context, you're not nourishing the trust. You don't trust that the other person has your best good at mind. So you take the most negative possible interpretation of what that person is saying or what that person is doing. So the idea of a right spirit is related to all of this. And then he asks for a clean heart. And what is a clean heart? A clean heart, I think, is authenticity. It's where you're truly open to be examined, truly open to be in relationship, truly open to another. Authenticity is where the inside and the outside are the same. The prostitute is the total opposite. What is inside and what is outside is totally different. Acting is where the inside and the outside are totally different. David seeks authenticity, where what he says and what he does is a genuine expression of who he is. Gary, you had a comment.
The heart in the Bible often refers to the mind, or is talking about the mind. And one way I looked at that, give me a clean heart, is make it so that my mind's filters are as good as possible. Clear out the garbage, clear out the misconceptions, clear out the prejudices, clear out the whatever. And being able to do that, to me, also is giving you a clean heart or a clean mind, so that now you can process things to the best of your ability.
And the concept of a filter is another analogy. We speak of these things in analogies and metaphors and so on. So one idea is that there be no blockage, that you not filter out what God is trying to communicate to you. I think one of the distortions of sin is we tend to filter out information that goes against what we already are convicted of or what we already believe. And God's trying to reach us, but we just filter out that which is coming from God and don't allow it to actually impact us in the way that it could. As a counselor through the years and tried to help people, often one of the things I've noticed is what I've come to call a discount machine. A person has a low sense of self-worth, and self-worth tends to grow when a person receives positive feedback and compliments and things like that. But there are people whose distorted thinking causes them to filter out the positives and zero in on the negatives. And that becomes a way of life. The negative is the reality, the positive is not the reality. And so there's a discount. Somebody says something nice, you say, well, let me reduce the value of that. It happens unconsciously. And trying to help people to truly be open to others, to be open to the positive feedback, and to drink it in and to allow it to have a role in shaping who you are. So David's prayer here gets down to the deep stuff. Verses 16 and 17 of Psalm 51.
For you have no delight in sacrifice. If I were to give a burnt offering, you would not be pleased. The sacrifice acceptable to God is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. O God, you will not despise.
So here, humble and repentant heart is what God is looking for. And David's prayer is right there with Hosea 6 and Micah 6, his Old Testament expression of what God is truly looking for. Trust is not just a word, it's a whole person response. And Henry's comment comes back to that. If we talk about knowing God, it's much more than just a mental response or a physical response. It's a whole person response. No reservations. And this is how peace in the universe will be restored. When we approach God with no reservations, truly open ourselves to God. James chapter 2 and verses 14 to 23. Another thing that people use when they question the centrality of faith is the idea of judgment by works. If we're going to be judged according to our works, then it isn't only faith, is it? What's the role of works in all of this? And how does that relate to faith/trust? James chapter 2 and first verses 14 to 19.
What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but do not have works? Can faith save you? If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and eat your fill, and yet you do not supply their bodily needs, what is the good of that? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. But someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without works, and I, by my works, will show you my faith. You believe that God is one, and you do well. Even the demons believe and shudder.
All right, this is a text that has gotten many people confused over the centuries because it talks about faith in kind of a negative, almost derogatory way. Faith is not enough. All right, so here's a text that will often be brought up as a challenge to what we're trying to share in the seminar. And I would point out that the faith that James is talking about here is not a deep faith. It is not a whole person faith. It's not that whole person commitment. And James himself will lay that out in a moment. But notice the kind of faith he's talking about is the kind the demons have. Do the demons know God? In a sense, they do. They know that he's very powerful. They're terrified of that. They know that they live at his allowance. They're terrified about that. But are they willing to trust God? In that fuller sense, they don't have faith. So James here in verse 19 helps us to see, don't take this as a contradiction to Romans, for example, where Paul says faith apart from works. Here James says no works, no faith. So James seems to be directly contradicting Paul, but he and Paul are using the term differently. Faith here means the kind of intellectual assent to a fact or an idea, but it's not a whole person commitment. It's not trust. So that's a difference between James and Paul. And this becomes clear in verses 20 to 24 of this chapter.
You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was brought to completion by the works. Thus, the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone.
All right, that on the surface is a direct challenge to what we've been saying and what Paul is saying elsewhere in Scripture. But again, if James is not using faith in quite the same way, I think that will help us in our understanding. So you see that verse 21, was not our ancestor Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac at the altar? All right, that's Genesis 22. Abraham is willing to offer his son on the altar, and James says that that action is how Abraham was considered righteous. For verse 22, you see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. All right, so Abraham's faith is completed in Genesis 22 by what he did. The two are connected. Verse 23, scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Where is that text? That's Genesis 15. That's before Isaac was born. That's before a whole bunch of other actions in the book of Genesis. It's a 40-year gap between Genesis 15 and Genesis 22. So what is James trying to do here? Genesis 15, Abraham is counted righteous. Genesis 15, his faith is all it took for him to be counted righteous. So what happens then in 22? 40 years later, Abraham demonstrates that he has whole-bodied, full-person commitment to God. And that was demonstrated in Abraham's actions when he and Isaac went to Mount Moriah. It isn't that Abraham was justified only because of Genesis 22. He was justified 40 years earlier. But Genesis 2 makes James's point that genuine faith is not intellectual assent. It's not simply saying, yeah, I know there's a God and I know he's this and that. No, genuine faith is trust. It's trusting God even when you don't have all the ducks in a row. And that's what Abraham did 40 years later, showing that the faith that he had in Genesis 15 was real faith, was saving faith, was true trust in God. The faith of Genesis 15 is not completed in Genesis 22. It is demonstrated in Genesis 22. So James and Paul are not at odds with each other. As I like to say sometimes in class, James and Paul are not fighting face to face. They're fighting back to back. Each of them is facing a different way of undermining the truth about God. Paul is fighting those who would bring works, say God needs you to do this, that, or other before he will love you. Paul is fighting against that, the desecration of the character of God. And James is fighting against its complete opposite. And that's the idea that the faith we're talking about here doesn't have to be a whole person thing. It can simply be a checkbox you tick off. So both of them are fighting extremes, but they're fighting in different directions. And so their language has its purpose within that context. All right, Dan?
I think when we talk sometimes about these things, they can be fairly theoretical. But it seems to me that when you talk about Abraham or Moses or David or Paul or even Peter, that they're actually case studies of different types of relationships people had with God. And it seems like there's so much written about David, but it seems like that's appropriate because David seemed to have had such a complex and varied relationship with God. Mm-hmm. And so I think sometimes we sort of get lost in the theory instead of looking and saying, am I more like Moses or am I someone who has weaker faith? But it seems to me that we can identify in different ways with this and say, okay, we're talking about faith and trust and many other sort of abstract ideas, but in fact, they're very practically demonstrated in these different characters that you've been describing to us.
Mm-hmm. Yes, a very good point. I like the phrase case studies. That's kind of a legal phrase, but I think it also plays out in the scientific realm. It's the idea that, for example, when a case is decided in court, you look at the previous cases, each of which may be a little bit different. And in that process, you develop a clearer understanding of how the law might apply to a given situation. So very helpful. Yes, the idea that the Bible is full of case studies. All right, I see Bob Kern and Bob Tiprick both. So Bob Kern, if you would go next.
It seems that Paul and James and others are describing a dynamic faith versus a static faith. A static is standing still, and it's probably a little bit easier to describe something that's standing still. The dynamic something or other is always in motion, is always doing something. And so you get a glimpse of it and you try to describe it, but you're describing the glimpse that you just saw and not necessarily the thing that you just saw. And it seems to me that this faith and knowing, it's a little bit like a rectangle and a square. You can know something but not have faith in it. But in order to have faith in someone, you must know them.
Right. Yeah, faith is deeply personal. It's not something casual whatsoever. Your comments reminded me that Graham Maxwell liked to draw a contrast between the faith of a child and the faith of an adult. And I think that's an important concept here. The faith of a child can be very simple. The faith of an adult tends to be complex and exercised in a variety of different situations, some of them disappointing, some of them encouraging. So what we're attempting to do here is probe the depths of faith from an adult perspective. All right, Bob Tiprick.
You're right on the court issue. A lot of time is spent on, especially in the common law system. It's a little different than the Code of Napoleon, which is more statutory. But in the common law system, precedent's very critical. And the idea is that you need to be able to look at precedents to know what you should govern your actions by over a long period of time. And so we even studied English cases in law school where we could cite cases from other common law countries like Britain or Canada. You don't usually do that, but if you don't have any precedent in, say, California, you can reach across boundaries for the reasoning in other places. The second thing I thought about as we're talking about Isaac and Abraham and Mount Moriah is how important it is to know that you're relying on God, that God's the one you're in communication with, because there's a lot of stories of people who have followed, like a Jim Jones or David Koresh, where people would feel like they were following a divine type figure and go into terrible traps. So that is where, to anybody listening, they've got to be sure it's God that they're hearing from and not another spirit. And that discernment is very critical, is it not?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Because there's hundreds of philosophies out there that claim to be divine and could easily bring people into other places. But I suppose that's the art of staying close to God, is knowing you're really talking with God or God is talking with you in some way.
Okay. Larry.
The point in this, item number 7, when we're talking about knowing God, loving God, justified, and then the concept of reading through what is being perfect. In our last session, we discussed and contrasted the idea of the progression of faith, if you will, between Habakkuk, where he was talking about it, in Romans 1:17. And one of the versions that I have of Romans 1:17 says that it begins with faith and ends with faith, leading the idea, based on our discussion, that it's a progress. And I think both Graham Maxwell and Ellen White have stated that the perfection is the progression. But after we had that really good discussion on the Greek idea of faith, if it starts with God being proven faithful, and I respond to that, and that leads me, therefore, to become faithful because we've known him. And I think that's what's describing here when we're talking about Abraham. As he knew God, because there's clearly evidences where he made mistakes, where he didn't trust God, passing his wife off as his sister twice before he got to this point. And yet that's not mentioned here. So the whole idea here is that progression. And yes, in the concept of progression, Moses made mistakes. Abraham made mistakes. We all make mistakes. David made his share of mistakes that we've been reading about, but it's the progression. I actually had a friend of mine this week ask me about David and being a warrior and all the people that he killed and what he did with Uriah. He said, well, how does God handle that? I said, so you need to look at how and why God said David was a man after his own heart. So if David was truly a man after God's own heart, is God saying it's okay to do these other things, or are we asking the wrong question about what God is like? Then we had this whole discussion about that whole process. But I think that this enables people to realize that whatever mistake is happening in my life that I did yesterday that's bothering me today, the progression of faith is something that we can look to the past and hang on to what God has done to enable us to hang on to what we need to do. And I think James is talking about that. He's contrasting those two ideas, I think.
Yeah, James is being practical about this, and I think that highlights the idea that faith is a whole person experience. This becomes even clearer, I think, in John chapter 3 and verse 3.
Jesus answered him, very truly, I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God without being born from above.
Okay. Many people would raise the question, how can you say it's faith alone? How can you say it's all about trust? This is the one thing God's looking for. Don't we need to be born again? Doesn't there need to be transformation? One of the hang-ups that you get into with the justification by faith metaphor, which is a very biblical one, very central to many parts of the Bible, but it's an analogy like many others. And one of the shortcomings of the analogy is the idea that if you're seeing salvation from a law court perspective, then the one thing that you need is forgiveness. You're a sinner, you're guilty in front of the court, and the solution to that guilt would be acquittal, forgiveness, etc. And those are biblical metaphors. But clearly what faith, trust is talking about is more than forgiveness. Faith and trust are part of a whole person experience that includes transformation of the life. So faith and trust is a single transforming experience that covers everything in life. It's the core of what God wants from us. And trust is involved in every other way that the Bible expresses what God is looking for from us. All right, let's go on to number 8 in your outline. And in number 8, it says, the question that now arises is how much trust do I need? And this becomes clear with a study of the New Testament word for obedience. So the question is, how much trust do I need? This is inevitably where people will go. When you say, okay, if trust is the one thing God is looking for, how do I know I've got enough? We're always seeking to understand those things. And I need to give two answers to it. The first answer is, in one sense, not much at all. In one sense, it's really easy. It's not difficult at all. So Matthew 17 and verse 20.
He said to them, "Because of your little faith, for truly I tell you, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you."
Okay? So if you have the faith of a mustard seed, which in ancient times was thought to be about the smallest of seeds. Now we know that seeds can be much smaller. That's what gives people allergies, I think, things you don't even see. But mustard seed at the time was a way of saying, this is as small as it gets. So if your faith is like a mustard seed, you can move a mountain. Luke 17:6, Jesus responding to the same issue.
The Lord replied, "If you had faith the size of a mustard seed, you could say to this mulberry tree, 'Be uprooted and planted in the sea,' and it would obey you."
See, clearly the outcome is not the issue here. You can move mountains with faith. You can move mulberry trees with faith. I'm not sure why one would want to. But on the other hand, I'm not sure why one would want to move a mountain either, except if you want a nice leisurely walk right through that space. But it's not the outcome that's the key. Jesus is basically saying you don't need a ton of trust. You don't need a ton of faith to please God. And there's a sense in which it's easy. Anyone can do it. Anyone in the universe can do it. The Bible doubles down on this when you get to Romans 12 and verse 3. Romans 12, verse 3 is a shocking kind of a statement by Paul.
"For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you not to think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned." All
right, so it says that God has given us a measure of faith. Now, if you want to know how much that is, you can find out in Revelation 6, where you have a reference to a quart of wheat for a denarius or 3 quarts of barley for a denarius. Same word. It's about a quart in size. Now, if you have enough faith to move a mountain with a mustard seed, what if you had a quart jar full of mustard seeds? Could you move a galaxy at that point? You see? What the Bible is telling us is there's a sense in which faith is easy. There's a sense in which trust is not asking much at all. We've all been given the gift of faith. We all have that capacity. And even if our quart jar is emptier compared to the next person, we've still got more than enough to trust in God, more than enough to be saved, more than enough to be trusted in His kingdom. The issue ultimately is if we're willing to exercise the faith that we have, the trust that we have. A lot of mustard seeds that can fit in a quart jar. So the point, faith is not hard. It's doable. It's even a gift if we're willing to receive it. It's a gift. Larry, go ahead.
If you're starting out your life as a Christian and you do have faith, a small amount, like the mustard seed, but if you've been at this now for 50 or 70 years, do you still need more than just a mustard seed? I don't mean that God's going to throw you out, because some people just can't progress like other can, and that's a different topic. But is it relative that my faith today should be different, potentially greater than it was 20 years ago, and that if I'm still here in 20 years, that hopefully it will be even greater than that, so that I'm beginning to fill up my quart jar?
Makes a lot of sense to me. After all, Jesus talks about having the faith of a little child to enter the kingdom. He doesn't say to stay in the kingdom, but he says the entry point is the faith of a child. So that is enough. And this side of the biblical dilemma is clear. A small amount of faith is enough if you simply exercise it. God is asking for response. I like the physician analogy. If a physician has diagnosed you and has a cure for your disease, you still have to accept it. You still have to be willing to let the doctor do the doctor's work. If you're not willing, the doctor can't do anything for you. I mean, you can stay away from the office and the doctor can do nothing about that. If somebody captures you and ties you down in a hospital bed, the odds are different, you see. But that's not how God works. God doesn't tie us down and say, you're going to take this faith whether you want it or not. Ultimately, there's a choice involved. Iris.
For me personally, I have come to conclude that if it's not about performance, if it is not about having to measure up, but if it is about knowing God better, this perspective lends actually meaning to the trials of life. It leads me to a perspective where basically every time a crisis or a challenge comes is, for me personally, an invitation to trust God more, to experience Him on a deeper level, and to see Him as the one who invites me to that trust and to ultimately have an experience with Him. And as I look back, there are many milestones in my life that have shown me time and again how God has been faithful to me, how He has met me when I thought, I can't do this. And I think these experiences make Him real, make Him personal. And I think that is then that trust that has to do with deeper knowing of who God is for me personally. And I think each one of us is invited over our lifetime to come to know God on a very personal level, of exercising faith and as a result going strengthened into the next crisis.
Mm-hmm. And again, you're contrasting the child faith and the adult faith, I think, and building on both of you. The Bible not only tells us that faith is easy, the Bible also tells us that it's very, very hard. Luke 18, verses 18 to 27, there's a story told that illustrates how difficult faith can be.
A certain ruler asked him, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone. You know the commandments. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not murder. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. Honor your father and mother." He replied, "I have kept these all since my youth." When Jesus heard this, he said to him, "There is still one thing lacking. Sell all that you own and distribute the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come and follow me." But when he heard this, he became very sad, for he was very rich. Jesus looked at him and said, "How hard it is for those who have wealth to enter the kingdom of God. Indeed, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God." Those who heard it said, "Then who can be saved?" He replied, "What is impossible for mortals is possible for God."
So there you see, the disciples saw this encounter, and they basically said, if that's what you're talking about, none of us can possibly stack up. So there's a sense in which faith is very hard. And we saw that also in the Abraham story, where ultimately the demonstration of his faith was, he thought, the sacrifice of his son, something overwhelming that none of us have been asked to do. So faith on the one hand is easy, but on the other hand, it's very, very hard. The action Jesus was requesting seems at first glance completely, what does that have to do with anything? But the action Jesus is asking would be a demonstration of this man's trust. Did he trust Jesus? Did he trust God enough to drop all of his possessions if that's what God asked? That was the question. It doesn't matter whether it's a mountain or a mulberry tree or a bank account. The question here is the trust, the kind of trust that can put God first in the face of these other options. It's the trust and the commitment that matters. Giving up the money showed a trust in Jesus' word. Now, I'll stop here for a moment. There's a comment here from Bill Church. And Bill, I think I'm getting a glimpse of where you're going, but I think there's a lot more behind it. And I'd like you to comment if you're willing to do so when I'm done with this. But a faith trust is between God and I. Trying to compare faith trust between individuals is a false task. Would you care to comment further on that?
A relationship is between God and ourselves, and it's hard enough at times just building that relationship, oftentimes I'm saying to myself, well, exactly the questions, how much trust, how much faith is enough? Do I trust? Every day I wonder in my conversations with God, how do I know that I am allowing God full reign in my life? Am I giving him every aspect of my being that I am trusting? Am I trusting or am I not trusting? I don't know, maybe I am digging myself into a big hole with all of this.
You're being very human and very honest, and I appreciate that.
I have so much involved in just trying to give my own life to God and to follow his leading and listening for his voice, that to spend any time at all comparing my faith with someone else in my church body or someone else within the Pine Knoll family, it's ludicrous to me to even be involved in that. We all have our calling. We all have had our pasts. Some pasts have been in tune with God their entire lives. Others, like myself, not so much. So I find no value in that for me, not to take away from previous comments at all on that issue. It's the way life is. Who is it that says no one can save anyone else? It's only our own relationship. Only we can, in our relationship with God, can we find salvation.
Excellent comment, excellent caution. And I think the temptation is always there when we're talking about how much faith. If that's enough for somebody else, it's probably enough for me. And I think you make a good point that ultimately the actions that we do are demonstrations to the heavenly universe, to ourselves, and sometimes to those around us of the faith, the trust that we have. But the actions themselves are not the faith and the trust. They are evidence of it. And so the thing about all this is the Bible is right. It's both easy and hard. It depends on how you're looking at it. And the very last section of this particular seminar, we want to talk more about the easy, because that's what I want to leave you on. Yes, you have the Abraham story. Yes, you have the rich young ruler. But God rarely asks faith to be that expensive. Those were unusual circumstances to show the length to which faith can be exercised in challenging circumstances, because there are some people who go through those kind of challenges. And to have in the Bible a faith deep enough to meet every challenge, that's very important. But at the same time, I think you're right, it can kind of discourage us a little in the sense that, would I be able to do that? Would I be able to go through the time of trouble? Would I be able to sacrifice my son? Would I be able to give up everything I've got? Well, in most cases, God doesn't ask that. But the Bible needs to be prepared for those times and circumstances when that is required. So, yeah, I like to end on the easy part, and we will do that. Iris?
When I see God is the one who is really in charge of growing me. Number one, as an educator, I know that if you want to see your students grow, you have to challenge them. You likely give them a piece that is bigger than they thought they can handle. And then you help them to make steps towards that to facilitate their growth, And I would like to say that pattern is, I think, also visible in the Bible. We see Moses, he blew it at the beginning of his life. God took time. 40 years later, he shows up again. And Moses is totally out of his comfort zone. And he says, no way I'm going to be a leader. There is nothing that would get me there, right? So I think the fact that when God shows up and gives us the burning bush experience, we often have a keen awareness that this is beyond what we can come up with. But I think that is healthy, because then we're not self-reliant. I think that the moments when I mostly am at risk in sinking is when I am relying on my own power, when I am very keenly aware that this is God's size of a problem. I don't even try to pretend anything. I'm just going straight to him and I say, okay, God, I don't have what it takes here for this situation. But as we see, whether it's Abraham, whether it is Moses, how God works with these saints ongoingly, despite their imperfections, despite the ups and downs of life, we see that there is something real, something genuine that develops over time.
Thank you. Yeah. I think One comment that reflects both on yours and also Bill's. Jesus makes the comment, to him much is given, much is required. I think this thing is just as easy for me as for any of you, and it's just as hard for me as for any of you. Where we are in this life is where God has placed us, and we're invited to grow what God has given us the best that we can. But at every step of life, there are challenges. And so it's easy and it's hard in the same sense. But coming back to number 8, there's a sentence here that says, the study of the New Testament word for obedience, the Greek is hupakoe, 4 syllables there, hupakoe. Akoe is a form of the Greek word for hearing. Akuo is the verb form. Akoe is more of a noun form, is to listen, to hear. And the hoop, it's a compound word. The hoop is the word for under. We have that in the medical term hypoglycemia, that hoop, the hype, that is the under. It's where your blood sugar is below where it ought to be. So hypoglycemia, hupakoe, is to listen under, to listen under. And it's the idea of humbly, putting yourself under an authority, under a source. Listening under is the core of what obedience is all about. I think we sometimes get twisted into a knot when we think, okay, well, I have faith, but I've got to also do these things. I've got to obey. Well, really, obedience at the bottom is not a great deal different than faith and trust, because at the bottom, it's an attitude. If you remember, the whole sin problem began with an attitude, with a way of thinking, and the solution is a change of attitude. And hupakoe is an attitude where we're willing to listen, where total commitment can be hard, but a total willingness, that is something that's within reach. We can be willing to be made willing. And I want to illustrate that. In Conversations About God, there was a discussion between Lou Venden and Graham Maxwell that touched on this, and I wanted to go a little bit deeper if I could. The question was, did God ever allow Satan a second chance? And in the discussion there, it was noted there's no biblical text that particularly answers that question. Did Satan have a second chance? Was it once and you're out? The Bible doesn't address that. There is a text, though, 1 Peter 3:9, that implies at least that God's patience is almost infinite for those who have messed up. In fact, God is so patient, people think he'll never act against rebellion. But Ellen White does seem to speak to this issue, and there's a powerful passage in the book Patriarchs and Prophets, page 39 to 40. And I'd like to share that with you because I think it kind of sums up in a way everything we've been talking about here. And I will read. It's a couple of paragraphs. It'll take a couple minutes, but I think it'll be worthwhile. In great mercy, according to his divine character, God bore along with Lucifer. The spirit of discontent and disaffection had never before been known in heaven. It was a new element, strange, mysterious, unaccountable. Lucifer himself had not at first been acquainted with the real nature of his feelings. For a time he had feared to express the workings and imaginings of his mind. Yet he did not dismiss them. He did not see whither he was drifting. But such efforts as infinite love and wisdom only could devise were made to convince him of his error. So here you see, Satan is already slipping, but God is working hard to reclaim him. His disaffection was proved to be without cause. He was made to see what would be the result of persisting in revolt. Lucifer was convinced that he was in the wrong. He saw that the Lord is righteous in all his ways and holy in all his works, that the divine statutes are just, and that he ought to acknowledge them as such before all heaven. Had he done this, he might have saved himself and many angels. He had not at that time fully cast off his allegiance to God, though he had left his position as covering cherub. Yet if he had been willing to return to God, acknowledging the Creator's wisdom, and satisfied to fill the place appointed him in God's great plan, he would have been reinstated in his office. That blows my mind. He had already left his place. He was already engaged in rebellion, yet God was willing to put him back in the highest place in all creation. The time had come for a final decision. So here's why I'm sharing this with you, because it's the kind of wrestling I think we're all doing with this. The time had come for a final decision. He must fully yield to the divine sovereignty or place himself in open rebellion. He nearly reached the decision to return, but pride forbade him. It was too great a sacrifice for one who had been so highly honored to confess that he had been in error, that his imaginings were false, and to yield to the authority which he had been working to prove unjust. A compassionate creator, in yearning pity for Lucifer and his followers, was seeking to draw them back from the abyss of ruin into which they were about to plunge. But his mercy was misinterpreted. Lucifer pointed to the long-suffering of God as an evidence of his own superiority, an indication that the King of the universe would yet accede to his terms. If the angels would stand firmly with him, he declared, they could yet gain all that they desired. He persistently defended his own course and fully committed himself to the great controversy against his Maker. Thus it was that Lucifer, the light bearer, the sharer of God's glory, the attendant of his throne, by transgression became Satan, the adversary of God and holy beings, and the destroyer of those whom heaven had committed to his guidance and his guardianship. End of quote. And in reflecting on that, I notice the idea of Satan having the option of being on one side and the other, but was in the middle, was wrestling, was on a continuum between total commitment to God and total commitment to rebellion. Those were the options. And in the end, after much wrestling and after much thinking and whatnot, Satan totally committed to rebellion. So there's those two options. Faith, trust is about that total commitment to God. And Satan had that as an option, but he chose otherwise. Now here comes the question then. How much faith is enough? And I would answer, what you have is enough, if you will. And I've mentioned this before in this group, but I think it's appropriate at this time. I've often talked about situations in which I felt like maybe 80% of me wanted to do what I want to do, and 20% of me wanted to do what God wanted me to do, and being caught in that middle. Maybe it's what Revelation means by Laodicea. But we're often caught in that middle. And part of us wants to commit completely to God, and part of us says, no, I want it my way. That's where Satan was. He was caught in the middle. And his pride, in the end, forbade him to nurture that part that was willing to commit to God. As it says in here, he was convinced that he was wrong, and he almost reached a positive decision to recommit to God. But pride forbade him. And what I've always encouraged people to do is, if you find yourself today in a 50-50 situation or a 20-80 or so on, the invitation is give God what you've got. Give him the 20%, give him the 40%, give him the 50%, and let God grow it. It's a gift. You can't earn it. You can't do it by trying, but it's a gift. Faith is a gift. And if you take what you have and you offer it to God and say, I know that I'm divided, but I want you to grow me, and God will do it. So how much faith is enough? In that sense, what you have right now is enough if you're willing to commit it to him. I invite you to turn to number 9, the last part of the seminar. And the question in the comments was, where is that quote located? And the answer is Patriarchs and Prophets, pages 39 to 40. So it's about a page and a half in that book. So Ellen G. White, Patriarchs and Prophets, pages 39 and 40. Okay, very good. So number 9, read Hebrews 11, 31, 32, and verse 39. Hebrews 11, 31, and 32 first, and then skip over to verse 39.
By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had received the spies in peace. And what more should I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel, and of the prophets.
Verse 39.
Yet all these, though they were commended for their faith, did not receive what was promised.
There you see a fascinating declaration. All of these are commended for their faith, for their trust. These are illustrations of what God is looking for. Illustrations of faith/trust. Rahab, is she an example of faith? Well, she was a prostitute. Prostitutes are skilled liars. It's called faking it. And what does she do in the story? How does she exercise her faith? She tells the spies to head west into the mountains, and then tells the police to go east to the river. Surely they're going back to run across the river before you catch them, so hurry and get them. Yet, where is the faith that comes in with Rahab? Lying through her teeth to protect God's servants. Read verses 9 through 11 of Joshua 2. So Joshua 2, verses 9 to 11, and there you will see the faith of Abraham, faith of Rahab, a flawed faith, the faith of a liar, if you can believe that, and yet it was an example, an illustration of faith. Joshua 2, 9 to 11.
And she said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that dread of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt in fear before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites that were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. As soon as we heard it, our hearts failed, and there was no courage left in any of us because of you. The Lord your God is indeed God in heaven above and on earth below.
So here you see Rahab's testimony of faith. She had been studying God. She had been observing what God was doing through the Israelites. And so it's very, very clear that the acts that she does are acts of faith. They're acts where she's trusting God. She is committing herself to actions that could cost her life, actions that would make her a traitor to her people. That is where the faith exercised itself. The lying and so on, she was just using the natural skills that she already had to act on her faith. But she herself had been studying God and trusted God to the place where she was willing to commit her life and everything to follow him. Gideon, great example of faith, needing 2 fleeces and then some in order to really believe in God. Samson, David, my daughter would call them hot messes. When you look at their lives and so on, you say, these are not examples of much of anything. And yet, they are held up as examples of faith that at moments in life, and apparently in David's case, amazingly enough, his entire life, it tells us in Kings, he was a man of faith. He never yielded his allegiance to God. He was a mess as a human being and did all kinds of things that God did not approve of. For example, the killing of 200 innocent Philistines to fulfill a bet at a wedding, the killing of Uriah and his adultery with Bathsheba, and so on and so on. God has given this to show that it's really easy. It's easy in the sense that what God is looking for is a heart that is willing to truly trust him. And apparently, somehow, in spite of the mess, deep in his inner being, David trusted God his whole life long. And one more text, and this one to show how easy faith is. Luke 23 and verses 39 to 43. Luke 23 and verses 39 to 43. If anybody thinks there's a whole list that you have to accomplish before God will accept you, try this story.
One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us. But the other rebuked him, saying, Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said to Jesus, Remember me when you come into your kingdom. He replied, Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise.
All right, so here you have the story of a thief on the cross, a person who was condemned for his actions, which were very, very serious actions, not just a burglar, but this is somebody who truly had done some terrible things, hurting people and so on. And he comes to see in the man next to him on the cross evidence of a godlike character, evidence of perhaps the Messiah, evidence that even the Roman governor thought of him as a king of some sort, and saw the kindness with which Jesus dealt with people, even those who were nailing him to the cross. And something happened in the man, and he responded with the very, very rudiments of faith and trust. And he trusted Jesus enough to say, "Remember me when you come into my kingdom." No one can say that there's a long list of items that you have to do in order to exercise that faith, because the thief never had the chance. For those of us who are lifelong Christians, there may be multiple challenges to our faith, multiple invitations by God to go deeper and further and exercise it in even greater ways. But that is a lifelong adult relationship of faith. This man on the cross was a child, and therefore I can say with full confidence, wherever you are right now in the course of your life, you can right now, this moment, offer what you've got to God and invite him to grow your trust in him. The better we know him, the more we will trust him. And trusting children are safe to save. Because if you truly trust God, then in eternity, you will continue to listen under and continue to obey and continue to seek to know all that you can of God. Trusting children are safe to save, and therefore faith, trust is the ultimate requirement for eternity. Remember the prodigal son? His moment of faith and trust was the moment he was willing to come back, when it dawned on him that maybe my father doesn't want me as a son anymore, but boy, he treats the servants better than I'm being treated here. If I even go in as a slave, my life would be better than where it is now. And so with that rudiment recognition, he says, maybe it's safe to approach my father after all, in spite of everything I've done. And he trusted that his life would be better with his father. And he discovered that the father was ready and willing to receive him, not just as a slave, but as a son. So the conclusion, I think, what does God really want? God wants trust, a whole person commitment that has saving power, because God will save all who trust him. Now, we've been talking a little bit here in this seminar about how we can come to trust God and how we can make choices and how we can grow our faith. But in the next seminar, we want to talk about God's side of it, what God does to build faith and build trust in us. Before I close, I want to just take a quick look at the chat list, and I notice a couple of people have offered additional quotations of a similar nature to the one that I read. One of these is Story of Redemption, which is an earlier version of Patriarchs and Prophets. And on page 26 of Story of Redemption, it's a later instance, but with a different outcome. And I assume that's talking about the fact that some of the followers of Satan did decide to stay. And that's very encouraging to note. And then Great Controversy, pages 495 and 496, also parallels that. That also is an earlier statement. Patriarchs and Prophets is, in this case, the later statement and perhaps the most complete to her intention. Now, Larry offers a comment. He says, if people of faith are going to be our heavenly neighbors, do we need to rethink what life in heaven may be like? And Henry responds, 1,000 years of rehab. That's how I think it will be. All right. I like that. I like that. I once thought that somehow at the second coming we'd be magically transformed, be totally different than who we are. And yet God, I think, is going to respect our experience, the things we've learned from our failures as well as the positives. And why is 1,000 years designated if it is not to have some impact on continuing to grow our trust, continuing to feel safer and safer in God's hands? After all, as I've sometimes said, what if a concentration camp guard was converted later on and came to Jesus and meets one of the Jewish prisoners in heaven? What's that going to be like? What if David and Uriah meet in heaven, as I suspect they will? It's probably not going to be instant recovery. It may take a while for us to wrestle with who is there and who is not there and why. God has allowed 1,000 years to continue the journey that we are now on. And Larry says group rehab. I think that's also true. Maybe I should just mention a professor at the seminary at Andrews University named Oliver Glans has proposed something for the millennium that I think is absolutely spectacular. He basically says what the investigative judgment is. In other words, the judgment that's going on in heaven right now is God producing our biographies. And those biographies are based on heavenly intelligence, which means they're way more accurate than we know of ourselves. All of the strengths, all of the weaknesses, all the flaws, etc. And thus, the heavenly intelligence on the basis of those biographies can determine that we would be safe to save or not. And then he proposes that in eternity, we will each be given a copy of our own biography, and that our first task will be reading and wrestling. And they will probably get into small groups, and we'll each be reading each other's biographies and wrestling together. And at some point during the 1,000 years, we'll get a personal visit from the teacher himself, the one who oversaw those biographies, and he will get to explain some of the things that even then we didn't understand. I don't know about you, that sounds like, in a way, scary, but a really exciting process. Speculative, perhaps, but I like the idea that God isn't finished with us yet. The commitment needs to be complete. The commitment needs to be there, because if we're not committed, then we could end up going south in eternity. But if the commitment is there, if we're listening under, if we trust, we will trust that the people who he chose to be there will end up having as friends, David and Uriah. That'll be awesome to see. Let me just read Daniel's comment here. Daniel says, Adventism is about rethinking of everything. Pioneers did rethinking of eschatology and the Sabbath. There are vast aspects of theology and knowledge where it still was not done, based on evidence in the light of the character of God. So I think, millennium, there's going to be a lot of education going on and a lot of group therapy. I like that concept. All right. So this draws to a conclusion our seminar on what does God really want, our seminar on faith/trust. In the one sense, faith is very easy. It's something anyone can do. In another sense, it's something we are challenged to exercise, receive, to grow with lifelong, and perhaps even partway into eternity, if not all the way through. We're grateful to understand this and are grateful that God has set a way to restore the universe that doesn't leave anyone out. Anyone can exercise faith. We've all been given a measure of faith. So let's close at this time with a prayer. Dear Lord, I thank you for helping us gain a deeper understanding of faith. It's one of those things that many of us have wrestled with for years, and we use the word so lightly, just have faith, have a little more faith, and so on. And yet we're not 100% sure always what we're talking about. I pray, Lord, that as we spend more time with you, looking at you, studying you, listening to you, that you would give us willing, trusting hearts to learn and grow from you. And I pray that the journey that we're doing in this class will just be a foretaste of an even more exciting seminar yet to come. And we look forward to that in the name of Jesus. Amen.